Recent reports about Korea's shifting demographic landscape are serving as a reminder about the daunting task ahead for the country as it needs to better accommodate an aging population while addressing an alarmingly low fertility rate. So how does Korea's fertility rate compare to that of its counterparts? What is behind the dismal birth rate? And ultimately, what can be done to tackle the tasks of a silver society? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Dramatic changes in Korea's demographic portrait are raising concerns about the future of the country as it faces an aging society that is giving birth to fewer children. For more, I have Kwon Soa here in the studio. Soa, it's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I also have Steven Borowiec with us. Steven, as always, it's a pleasure.
Nice to be here.
Right, so let's start with the figures then that prove Korea's fertility rate is indeed as low as we say it is, and how it compares to that of its counterparts.
Sure. So South Korea's birth rate has been steadily going down. It's a phenomenon that's been shared by many countries, especially developed ones. But in Korea's case, it's just a little more extreme. The country recorded the world's lowest fertility rate in 2021, only to break its own record from the year before. So let's take a look at this graph here. Since year 2016, Korea's total fertility rate has been on the decline, so for 6 straight years. In 2018, the figure dropped to below 1 for the first time since data was compiled, and in 2020, the country reported more deaths than births. And as you can see, last year, the rate stands at 0.81, and we're expecting it to fall even further as the last 2 quarters of the year, Korea's fertility rate came at 0.75 and 0.79 respectively. And previous trends show us that fewer babies are actually born by the end of the year, which is why Statistics Korea predicts the total fertility rate of year 2022 to turn out at around 0.77. That would be around 250,000 children. By the way, the total fertility rate is defined as the total number of children that would be born to each woman if she were to live to the end of her childbearing years, according to the OECD. And speaking of the OECD, let's now turn our attention to the OECD ranking in terms of birth rates by country. The average number of children a woman gives birth to among the OECD is around 1.6 as of 2020, with Israel's birth rate closest to 3. Then we have Mexico at around 2, but then from then on, the majority's rate stands at below 2. The US at 1.6, and then South Korea's neighbor Japan 1.3, Italy 1.2. But notice that Korea is the only nation here below a rate of 1. So that is the current status.
Right, I see. And that being said, Steven, speaking as a journalist who has been based here in this part of the world for quite a while, what do you believe are some of the main reasons behind Korea's low fertility rate?
Well, when seeking to explain difficult socio or political questions, it usually makes sense to look at the economy. And I think that's an incomplete explanation, but I think you can go some ways to explaining this if you look at just like some basic numbers, like what's the average home costs here. And then you compare that to what an average person earns when they're young. You know, the average person in perhaps their late 20s or early 30s, when they come out of school, they might only be earning, 3 million won a month or something like that. And so when you factor in all the different ways in which the cost of living is rising, the cost of energy, the cost of food, the cost of everything that anybody needs to be comfortable, and then you factor all that in and you compare it to just how expensive it is to get a decent house in a home that would be large enough to raise a child in a neighborhood that has access to decent schools and to daycare facilities and all that. That's one thing, and I think that probably there's a lot of young people who are going through this country's very difficult competition for stable and reasonably well-paid jobs, and they're getting into their careers and they're getting established, and kind of for the first times in their life, maybe in their early marriage years, they're feeling for the first time ever a kind of freedom or a kind of stability and a kind of sense of peace and stability that they've kind of made it to a relatively comfortable part of their life. And then the question then becomes, as probably their parents and their grandparents are reminding them, it's time to have a kid. And these people are asking themselves, like, well, do I incur a whole bunch more costs? Do I take on this huge responsibility? Do I deal with this very big complication? And, you know, we are living in a more individualistic era nowadays. I think that through a combination of, you know, just raw economic factors and social factors, there's more and more couples who are deciding to just remain the two of them.
Right. Which is why, so over the past 16 years, and do correct me if I'm wrong, Korea has reportedly spent over $200 billion on efforts to boost child birth, that is. And could you tell us a bit more about the current Yoon administration's efforts to encourage more couples to have children?
Right. First off, the $200 billion, that is correct according to what President Yoon Suk-yeol himself said at a cabinet meeting back in September, where he noted that more than 280 trillion won or $200 billion have been spent to tackle the population issue, adding that the demographic policies aimed at merely boosting fertility should be thoroughly reflected on, and that the government should push for new, effective policies based on what he said, science and data, not populism. And the Yoon administration unveiled a number of times some support measures for parents and children. And in fact, actually the fourth version of its 5-year plan starting 2023 has been announced by the government just today, this Tuesday, highlighting the unprecedented low fertility rate. And the plan focuses on comprehensive child care support for infants, as well as improving the quality of child care services. And this should serve as a way to reduce the financial burden on parents and give them also more room to balance work and child rearing. One of the biggest pledges includes a raise in child subsidies. So starting next year, households raising children from newborns to 1-year-olds will receive a higher amount of a so-called parent salary. So for parents of newborns of up to 12 months, this money will rise to 700,000 won from the current 300,000 won. And also for those of 1-year-olds, they will receive 350,000 won a month. And this is part of President Yoon's presidential campaign pledge, where he even vowed for 1 million won for each parents that have children aged up to 12 months, and that's also going to be fulfilled in 2024. Now, apart from that, the government has laid out an increase in other support measures, such as extended childcare at daycare centers, more additional care from specific hours from 4 to 7:30 p.m., for instance, and also an increased wage for caretakers. But despite all of these efforts, criticism remains regarding the effectiveness of these measures, as in the end, the essence seems to be spending more expenditures in this field. So something that Yoon's predecessors did as well during the past 16 years, as we earlier mentioned, where $200 billion were spent.
Right, and despite, of course, these financial support framework to encourage couples to have children, Stephen, as you mentioned earlier, finances are a problem here, but some pundits claim that the low fertility rate goes beyond finances and perhaps can be linked to social perceptions about the traditional family structure here in the country. What are your thoughts?
Well, it does, but before I get to that, I would just like to flag that, like, when we compare Korea to other countries that have slightly higher birth rates, one thing that I think it's important to point out is Korea still spends for all of these generous measures that the Yoon government and preceding governments have rolled out, and the fact that this country has universal daycare, which is wonderful. If you compare South Korea's overall welfare expenditures as a percentage of its GDP, it is still very low. If you compare it to other advanced countries in North America or Europe, it's still a very low percentage. So whenever I discuss this, I just want to flag that while these numbers can jump off the page when they're parsed as like individual expenditures, in the overall context, this country could really go a lot further with welfare spending. So that's a first step, but the other element that you allude to is a much more complicated one, the question of social perceptions, and that I do think is definitely a factor. It is still very uncommon for single-parent families, for childbirth out of wedlock. A lot of things that, you know, I'm from Canada, and I know plenty of people who have decided to have children without being married, and this society is still kind of quite rigid in what it expects of young people, that these social expectations can fall disproportionately hard on women. And when you operate as a society with only a very particular kind of ideal family in mind, where this is a man and a woman, and they are legally married, and they live in a certain kind of place, and they have this kind of vision for their life, like only in that particular scenario is it socially acceptable to have children, you're going to have fewer children because you're going to have fewer people who fit that mode. So if you do want to increase the birth rate, there needs to be a subsequent broadening of how people conceive of these issues culturally and psychologically. But that is a much more difficult nut to crack. That's a lot more difficult than a simple measure like extending childcare in daycare. So probably where the government really ought to start is with a fundamental expansion of these kinds of welfare supports, and then with time try to tackle the more complex questions of social and psychological perceptions of families.
Right, and complex they are, of course. That being said, moving forward, so another daunting task for Korea is that of accommodating its aging population. Before we delve into that, could you tell us a bit about Korea's life expectancy and how that compares to its OECD counterparts?
Well, Korea's life expectancy is above the average of major advanced countries. For Korean babies born last year, 83.6 years is the average. So rounding it up, it's almost 84 years now. And it's slightly up from 83.5 years for babies born in year 2020. And if we break it down by gender, it's 80.6 for boys, 86.6 for girls. So there is a 6-year gap. But the gender gap itself in life expectancy continues to decrease. So compared to the OECD average, Korea's life expectancies for women and men are 3.5 years and 2.9 years longer. And also, if you compare it back to 1970, now we're living more than 21 years longer than before back then. So having people live a longer life is good news, but ironically, it's not necessarily good if there are less babies born while life expectancy goes up, as it just adds to Korea's speed, rapidly aging society.
Right, and simply speaking, Stephen, what are the economic implications of an aging society?
There are many, but one kind of pressing one is it just means fewer people to buy things. You know, if you look at the grand scheme of human lifetimes, it's a relatively small part where people are in kind of their economic prime, especially in Korea, a country where people go to school for very long. Men have to do their mandatory military service for about 2 years. A lot of Koreans go on to graduate school, or they're going to delay their studies in their job-seeking process. And then people in Korea retire when they're fairly young. A lot of people retire, they're even still in maybe their late 50s or their early 60s. And so that's a relatively small window for when people are really economically productive. And so what this means is you have a kind of, I think what this is called is a dependency ratio. You have a lot of people in the society who are economically dependent on somebody else. And that might be children economically dependent on their parents, or elderly people economically dependent on their children. And so that means that those people have a real crunch in their discretionary spending, because even if they're earning well, they got to be taking care of their children, or they've got to be taking care of their parents. So they might even be facing these competing loyalties at the same time. And just in terms of economy like Korea, if you look at the way this economy works, it's very export dependent. The policymakers in this country and the innovators in technology have been very wise in creating products that people overseas want to buy. But a more difficult thing has been boosting domestic consumption, trying to achieve economic growth through the selling and the consuming of things domestically. In a scenario of an aging population, that becomes that much more difficult because of the pressures that I laid out. And so the Yoon administration and subsequent administrations will be spending a lot of time thinking about this, I think.
Right, and so staying with Stephen's picture about being economically dependent, that is one age group on the other, I hear some pundits have given some very grim prospects with regard to Korea for that scenario. Could you tell us more?
Yeah, economists predict that the old age to working age ratio to double in many countries over the next 4 decades. And in some countries, it's worse, the situation, including in Korea, because currently Korea has a younger than average population than the average of the OECD, but it has the fastest aging speed, the fastest speed in its aging population. And in fact, latest figures estimate Korea to become a super-aged society in 2025. So along with other countries like Greece, Poland, Portugal, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Spain, Korea is going to have that problem of too few people compared to its aging population. And experts thus believe by 2060, the working age population will plunge by 10% in 2060. But this goes for the entire world, not only in Korea.
Right, and like we have 10 seconds left, and Stephen, I ask you the million-dollar question: what can be done to address an aging society with fewer birth rates in the country?
Well, immigration is always an option. There's the option to let more people who want to relocate here and contribute to the economy, contribute to this society, and have their own babies here and have a kind of evolving sense of Korean society. But of course, that comes with there's a political battle to be had there. This is not a country with a robust history of immigration from abroad, but that's one solution that I hope policymakers will consider.
Right, hopefully. All right, Stephen, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Soa, thank you very much for your insights today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we say goodbye. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Do join us then. Thank you for now.